The biting wind clawed at Martha, a raw, scouring breath across the desolate plains. Her ragged dress offered little comfort against its chill. Ahead, the flickering orange glow of a Comanche camp, a place spoken of only in hushed, terrified whispers. But behind her, in the hollows of her children's eyes, lay a terror far greater. Samuel, small and frail, and Lily, whose breath was now a faint, shallow whisper against her neck, were fading. Starvation had etched its cruel signature upon their faces. Martha's own fear was a cold, tight knot in her belly, yet it was a dull ache compared to the sharp, stabbing pain of her children's suffering. She had nothing left. No food, no hope from her own kind, only one final, desperate currency to offer for their lives, herself, her body, her dignity, anything, if it meant they might eat. It was a mother's ultimate, unthinkable gamble on the very edge of annihilation. What awaited her in the stern gaze of the warriors by that fire, however, was not the savagery the settlers preached, but a profound, world-altering truth she could never have foreseen. There was a time Martha's world held the simple warmth of a life shared. A sturdy cabin in Redemption Creek, the comforting aroma of wood smoke, and Ben's quiet laughter. Her husband, Ben, strong and kind, had been the anchor of their small existence, his dreams for their future as wide as the prairie sky. Together, they chipped away at the wilderness, hoping to build a life, a family. But the frontier was a harsh mistress, giving with one hand and snatching away with the other. The fever, swift and merciless, had stolen Ben, leaving Martha a young widow. Her dreams turned to dust. Grief was a constant companion, but soon a colder shadow fell upon her, the scorn of Redemption Creek. Deacon Hemlock, a man whose pronouncements of piety were as rigid as his starched collar, saw Martha's quiet endurance not as strength, but as an affront. Her independence, her refusal to immediately seek remarriage in a town where eligible men were few, he twisted into a narrative of willfulness, a stubborn pride that bordered on the ungodly. Her sorrow, kept close and private, was deemed unnatural. A failed harvest, a winter that bit with uncommon ferocity. These common prairie trials were laid at her door. Whispers slithered through the dusty settlement, insidious and cruel. She brought misfortune. Some murmured. She was marked by ill luck, others decided, their eyes skittering away when she sought credit at the general store. Deacon Hemlock, from his pulpit, fanned these embers of suspicion into flames of judgment, speaking darkly of women who strayed from the righteous path, his gaze often finding Martha in the sparse congregation. Martha, a woman of few words but possessing a keen, almost painful awareness, observed it all. She saw the subtle shifts in expression, the doors that closed a little too quickly, the way acquaintances now hurried past. Her quiet nature, once praised as demure, now condemned her as secretive, even defiant. Ben had taught her to read the land, to notice the smallest signs. Now, she read the hardening faces of her neighbors with that same sharp focus. Inside, a battle raged, fear for her children, a raw, gnawing anxiety, fought against a rising tide of bitter indignation. She had done no wrong, yet she was being judged, condemned, and slowly starved out. Her meager savings, Ben's legacy, and the fruits of her own tireless mending, dwindled to nothing. Redemption Creek, a name that now tasted like ash in her mouth, offered no redemption, only cold shoulders and eventual ostracization. With a pathetic bundle containing their last worldly goods, she had led Samuel and Lily away from the town that had forsaken them. The vast, indifferent prairie was now their only refuge, their only path. She walked with her back straight, a mask of calm she did not feel, her eyes constantly scanning, assessing, every nerve ending alive to the harsh realities of survival. The last of their flour, baked into 3 small, hard biscuits, was a distant memory. Lily's cough, a dry, racking sound, was a constant chisel against Martha's heart. Samuel, barely 7, tried so hard to be brave, his small face set in an imitation of his father's stoicism, but his thinning frame betrayed their shared hunger. He tried, with small, fumbling hands, to set snares Ben had shown him, but the prairie remained stubbornly empty. Martha sank to her knees on the rough, unforgiving earth. The sky above was a vast, empty canvas of deepening blue, offering no solace, only reflecting the desolation within her. Redemption Creek was a closed door, a bitter memory of hypocrisy. Behind her, nothing but judgment. Ahead what? Then, a thin wisp of smoke against the darkening sky. Comanche. A jolt, cold and sharp, shot through her. Deacon Hemlock's voice, filled with righteous terror, echoed in her mind, painting lurid pictures of savage warriors, of unholy rituals, of brutal, merciless raids. She had seen, once, the charred ruins of a remote homestead, the horrifying aftermath attributed to a Comanche war party. Those images, seared into her memory, had fueled countless nightmares. Yet, as she looked at Lily, limp and pale in her arms, at Samuel's sunken eyes, that ingrained fear began to fray. What was the terror of the unknown compared to the agonizing certainty of watching her children waste away before her very eyes? The fearsome warrior of settler legend, his face painted for war, his eyes like chips of obsidian, that image, once a symbol of ultimate dread, now shifted, transformed by her desperation into a sliver of insane, improbable hope. A terrible, cold resolve settled in her. If the Comanche were the godless savages the settlers claimed, perhaps they would understand a transaction of pure, raw survival. She had nothing left to trade, no tools, no trinkets, no food, only her own flesh. The thought brought a wave of revulsion, a profound, body-shaking shame. But then she saw Samuel's small hand reach for hers, his touch a fragile plea. She saw Lily's eyelids flutter. The shame was incinerated by the fierce, unquenchable fire of a mother's love pushed beyond every known limit. She would make the offer. She would lay down the only thing of value she possessed if it meant her children might live to see another dawn. Her quiet resilience hardened into a grim, unyielding purpose. She rose, her legs trembling but her will like iron. Towards the smoke, towards the unknown, she forced her feet to move. The sun bled its final colors across the vast horizon as Martha, with Samuel and Lily stumbling beside her, drew near the Comanche camp. The air grew heavy with the sense of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the unfamiliar, pungent aroma of tanned hides and horses. Faint sounds reached them, and occasional dogs bark, the murmur of voices in a language that was a wild, guttural music to her ears, the distant, rhythmic pulse of a drum, like the very heartbeat of the plains. As they crested a slight rise, the camp unfolded before them, a scattering of conical teepees, their surfaces adorned with painted symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering firelight. And then, as if a silent signal had passed through the air, the everyday sounds of the camp ceased. The drumming stopped. The voices died. The dogs, however, erupted, their barks sharp, aggressive, making Lily cry out and shrink against Martha's legs. Figures began to emerge from the teepees, first one or two, then more, materializing from the shadows like spirits of the land. Men, their dark braids interwoven with feathers and beads, their bodies lean and taut with a predatory grace. Women, their faces inscrutable, their eyes sharp, missing nothing. They stood, simply watching, their collective stillness more terrifying than any shouted threat. Martha's breath hitched. The carefully constructed wall of her resolve threatened to crumble. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to flee into the embrace of the empty, indifferent prairie. But Samuel's small, cold hand tightened its grip in hers, and Lily let out a weak, pitiful moan. There could be no retreat. One warrior, taller than the rest, detached himself from the group and moved towards them. He walked with a fluid, panther-like grace, a contained power radiating from him that seemed to compress the very air. His face, framed by straight, dark hair that fell past the shoulders, was stern, unyielding, his eyes deep-set and piercing under a strong brow. He wore a simple breechcloth and beaded moccasins, a long knife clearly visible in its sheath at his hip. His chest and arms were bare, revealing the hard, sculpted muscle beneath skin the color of weathered oak. This was him, the warrior from the terrifying stories, the man who now embodied her last, desperate, and most shameful hope. This was Tavok. Martha instinctively nudged Samuel and Lily slightly behind her, her own thin frame a pathetically inadequate shield. Her lips felt cracked and dry, her tongue a clumsy weight in her mouth. She tried to swallow, but her throat was a tight knot of fear. The words she had rehearsed, the desperate plea, seemed to have evaporated. Tavok halted a few paces away, his gaze sweeping over her, then lingering on the children with an unnerving intensity. His expression did not alter by so much as a flicker. It was a mask of stoic indifference, revealing nothing of the thoughts or intentions of the man behind it. He did not speak. He simply waited, his stillness a silent, powerful challenge. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, broken only by Lily's shallow, ragged gasps and the frantic, too loud drumming of Martha's own heart against her ribs. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes burning into her, judging her, dissecting her. In Tavok's dark, unreadable eyes, she saw no compassion, no glimmer of understanding, only the impassive stare of a man who had undoubtedly witnessed every form of human suffering this harsh land could inflict. At last, summoning every last shred of her failing courage, Martha found her voice. It emerged as a reedy, broken whisper, nearly lost in the vastness of the prairie. She addressed him as warrior, her voice trembling, gesturing toward Samuel and Lily, their frail bodies speaking a more eloquent plea than any words. Her children, she explained, were starving. She paused, the shame a burning coal in her throat, but forced herself to meet his gaze. She had nothing, she told him, no food, nothing of value to trade. Then, the terrible words, forced out from the depths of her despair. She offered herself. For food. For them to live. The declaration hung in the heavy air, stark and brutal. Tavok's expression remained an unreadable cipher. His eyes, like polished jet, continued to hold hers, unwavering. He made no sound, no movement, gave no indication that he had truly understood the depth of her degradation. He just watched, his gaze seeming to pierce through her, to weigh the tattered remnants of her soul. He noted the way her worn dress clung to her bony frame, the raw, chapped skin of her trembling hands held protectively near her children. He saw the listless, hollow eyes of the boy, the deathly pallor of the girl, and he saw in Martha's own eyes a desperate, wild honesty, a raw plea stripped of all artifice. His own eyes seemed to narrow, almost imperceptibly. A minute's shift in the stoic mask. An agonizing moment passed. Then another. The pressure of his silence was a physical weight, crushing her. Tavok's gaze shifted slowly, from Martha's ravaged face to the two small, frightened figures huddled behind her. He did not acknowledge her offer. Instead, he made a slight, almost dismissive gesture with his chin towards the children. His voice, when it finally came, was deep, resonant, like the sound of rocks tumbling in a dry riverbed. He spoke in a mixture of his own tongue and heavily accented, broken English, his questions direct, seeking to understand who she was, and why she was here alone, with young ones, so far from any settlement of her people. Other warriors had begun to drift closer, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle behind Tavok. Their faces were hard, their eyes narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and stark curiosity. Martha felt their collective scrutiny like a brand. A few Comanche women, their expressions equally unreadable, but their eyes intensely observant, watched from the entrances of nearby teepees. Martha felt utterly exposed, stripped bare, her shame a palpable thing. She tried to answer his questions, the words tumbling out in a disjointed torrent of fear and desperation, her English fractured and halting. She spoke of Ben, of the sickness, of the town that had offered condemnation instead of compassion. The shame of her current plea warred with the fierce, unyielding love for her children, making her voice crack, her hands clench and unclench at her sides. Deacon Hemlock's damning words, His pronouncements of her sinfulness echoed in her mind. Would these men, these so-called savages, see her as he did, a fallen woman deserving of her fate? Or would they perceive the truth of her unbearable choice? The moment stretched into an agonizing eternity. The sun had now fully set, and the long, dancing shadows cast by the campfires seemed to writhe like malevolent spirits. Tavik began to move, slowly, deliberately, circling them. His moccasined feet were utterly silent on the packed earth. His eyes, sharp and analytical, missed nothing. The way Samuel, despite his terror, kept a protective hand on Lily's arm. Lily's shallow, labored breathing. Each tiny gasp a painful testament to their dwindling time. The stark hollows in Martha's cheeks, the frantic pulse beating visibly in the thin skin of her throat. He moved like a great cat, she thought, with a fresh surge of icy fear, circling its trapped prey, assessing its every weakness, its every point of vulnerability. A cold, profound dread settled deep in Martha's bones. This was it. The judgment. He would refuse. Or worse, he might accept her degrading offer, take what he wanted, and then cast them out anyway, to die on the plains. Or perhaps he would take the children. The thought was a fresh, unbearable agony. Tavik completed his slow circle and stopped before them once more. He bent down, his movements economical and fluid, and picked up a dry, brittle twig from the ground. He held it between his powerful fingers for a long moment, then, with a sudden, sharp crack that sliced through the tense silence, he snapped it cleanly in two. The sound made Martha flinch violently, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. Samuel gasped. Was this the final answer? A symbol of her broken life, her shattered hope? A brutal, silent dismissal of her desperate bargain? Her last, fragile sliver of hope disintegrated, leaving only a cold, hard residue of despair. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the end. Then, Tavik did something that defied all her expectations. He tossed the broken pieces of the twig aside, his expression, if anything, even more unreadable than before. He looked at Martha, a long, searching gaze that seemed to peel back layers of her fear and desperation. Then his eyes shifted to Samuel, and then to Lily, lingering on the small girl's pale, still face. He said nothing at all about Martha's shameful, desperate proposal. Not a single word. Instead, he straightened to his full, imposing height and turned, addressing his people in the rapid, flowing cadences of the Comanche tongue. His voice was firm, carrying an undeniable note of authority. Though Martha understood none of the words, the suffocating tension in the air around them seemed to subtly shift, to lessen almost imperceptibly. The warriors behind him murmured amongst themselves, their expressions still wary, but some of the overt hostility appeared to recede. An older woman, her face a rich map of wrinkles etched by sun and time, her dark hair generously streaked with silver, detached herself from the onlookers and moved towards them. She approached with a quiet, inherent dignity, her eyes, surprisingly gentle and filled with a deep wisdom, fixed on the children. She knelt before Lily, whose eyes were now closed, her breathing alarmingly faint. The woman murmured something soft and soothing in her own language, and then, from a beaded pouch at her waist, she produced a small piece of dark, dried fruit, its sweet aroma faintly reaching Martha. She offered it to Lily. Lily's eyelids fluttered open. She stared at the fruit, then looked up at Martha, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, fragile hope. Martha, tears now welling in her own eyes, managed a small, shaky nod of assent. Lily, her tiny hand trembling, reached out and took the fruit, slowly, hesitantly, bringing it to her lips. Tavik turned back to Martha. His dark eyes met hers directly, and for the very first time, she thought she detected something other than stern, implacable judgment in their depths. A flicker of something else. Understanding, perhaps even a hint of compassion. He told her, his English still careful and broken, but his meaning devastatingly clear, that her children were starving. He paused, his gaze intense. A woman's body, he stated, was not food. Not for children. He paused again, longer this time, as if choosing his next words with immense care. In their way, the Comanche way, he explained, children were sacred. They were the future of the people. His eyes flicked briefly to the other warriors, then returned to her. No warrior, he said, no true man, would take from a starving child's mother in such a manner. Martha stared at him, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend his words. Disbelief warred with a wild, burgeoning hope that was almost painful in its intensity. What was he saying? Then came the words that shattered all her desperate, fear-soaked expectations, words that would forever be burned into the fabric of her memory. You, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, and your children, you will come to my lodge. He made a gesture with his hand, not towards her in demand, but towards a large, well-maintained teepee set slightly apart from the others, its hide surface decorated with bold, painted symbols of power and protection. There is food there, he told her. Warmth. You will be safe. Martha could only stare, dumbfounded, her body swaying. The fierce warrior, the terrifying savage of her deepest nightmares and Redemption Creek's most dire warnings, was offering sanctuary. He was offering his own home. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The relief, so sudden, so overwhelming, was like a physical blow, threatening to buckle her knees. Tears, hot and unrestrained, finally broke free, carving clean paths through the dust and grime on her cheeks. The other Comanches watched, their expressions a mixture of surprise, lingering caution in some, but no longer open menace. Tavik had spoken. His word was evidently law. The older woman, who had given Lily the fruit, now gently took Martha's arm, her touch surprisingly firm and reassuring. She murmured something soft and gestured for Martha to follow, guiding the stunned woman and her 2 children towards Tavik's lodge. Samuel, still clutching his mother's hand tightly, looked up at the tall, imposing warrior with wide, unblinking eyes, a dawning sense of awe slowly replacing the terror that had held him captive. Inside Tavik's lodge, a small, carefully tended fire glowed in the central pit, its warmth a welcome, tangible blessing against the encroaching chill of the prairie night. Richly patterned buffalo robes were laid out on the packed earth floor, promising a comfort Martha had not dared to dream of. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and tanned leather, an aroma that Martha was already beginning to associate not with fear, but with an unbelievable, life-altering kindness. Soon, the older woman returned, carrying a steaming wooden bowl of stew, thick with chunks of meat and wild vegetables. The rich aroma alone was enough to make Martha's empty stomach clench with a painful, almost forgotten hunger. She watched, her heart overflowing with an emotion too vast for words, as Samuel and Lily ate. Slowly at first, their small bodies wary of this unexpected bounty. Then, with increasing urgency, their pale faces gradually losing some of their pinched, starved tightness. Lily even managed a weak, watery smile between spoonfuls, a sight so precious it brought a fresh wave of silent tears to Martha's eyes. Tavik entered the lodge a short time later and settled quietly on the opposite side of the fire, observing them with his customary stillness. His stern, warrior's expression had softened, almost imperceptibly, as he watched the children eat. He did not speak, did not intrude on their fragile peace, simply allowed them this space, this moment of profound nourishment and safety. The confrontation Martha had braced herself for had not been with the hostile savage, but with her own deeply ingrained prejudices, her own despair-fueled, desperate assumptions. The payoff was not merely the cessation of hunger, but the unexpected restoration of dignity, the astonishing gift of safety, of unadorned human compassion in its purest, most elemental form. The harsh, judgmental whispers of Redemption Creek, the damning pronouncements of Deacon Hemlock and his self-righteous flock, began to fade, their power to wound diminished by the quiet strength and profound, unlooked-for humanity she had found here, in the heart of a Comanche camp, within the lodge of a man she had been conditioned to fear above all others. Justice, she was beginning to understand, did not always wear the starched collar of so-called civilization. Sometimes it wore the stoic, observant face of a warrior who understood the sacred value of a child's life. Martha and her children remained in Tavik's lodge as the days grew shorter and the hard bite of winter took hold of the plains. The fierce prairie winds howled like hungry wolves outside the sturdy buffalo hide walls of the teepee, but inside there was consistent warmth, regular food, and an astonishing measure of tranquility. Martha, a woman of inherent quiet competence, slowly began to find a rhythm, a place. She assisted the older woman, whose name she learned through gestures and halting attempts at language, was she who remembers, with her daily tasks, scraping hides until they were soft and supple, grinding corn into meal with a heavy stone, mending garments with stitches as neat and strong as any of the Comanche women. She began to pick up words and phrases of their language, enough to understand simple requests, enough to offer a shy greeting or a word of thanks. Her natural quietness, which had been a mark against her in Redemption Creek, was accepted here without question. The Comanche were not a people given to frivolous chatter. They valued keen observation, enduring resilience, and an inner fortitude that had no need for loud proclamations. Martha possessed these qualities in quiet abundance. She watched, she listened, she learned, and she worked. Her hands, though initially unaccustomed to some of an Indian woman's tasks, growing deft and skilled. Gradually, almost without her noticing, she began to earn a quiet measure of respect from the other women, then from the men. The children, Samuel and Lily, blossomed under the unexpected care. The healthy color returned to their cheeks, their laughter, tentative and fragile at first, then more robust and frequent, echoed softly within the warm confines of the lodge. Lily's debilitating cough vanished entirely, replaced by the boundless energy and healthy exuberance of a child no longer shadowed by starvation and fear. Samuel, drawn by the rough-and-tumble games of the young Comanche boys, began to shed his shyness, his initial caution giving way to a bright-eyed curiosity and a surprising aptitude for their ways. Tavik remained a figure of quiet, unwavering authority. He never once alluded to Martha's initial, desperate offer. He never demanded recompense or service for the protection, food, and shelter he so generously provided. He treated her with a distant, almost formal courtesy, his gaze often thoughtful as he observed her interactions with his people, or her gentle, unwavering care for her own children. He was a man of few words, but his consistent actions spoke volumes of a deep well of character, a profound and innate sense of honor that utterly belied the savage caricature so often painted by the encroaching settlers. Martha found herself watching him, too, during the quiet evenings by the fire, noticing the almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when he looked at the children of the camp, the quiet patience with which he instructed the young boys in the use of the bow or the tracking of game, the immense, quiet dignity he carried in every line of his body, in every measured movement. When the first green shoots of spring began to push through the thawing earth, when the prairie grasses shed their winter brown for a vibrant, hopeful green, Tavik approached Martha. He had gathered provisions for them, a generous supply of dried meat, a sack of freshly ground cornmeal, a thick, warm buffalo robe. He led her to the edge of the sprawling camp and pointed toward a series of low, rolling hills in the hazy distance. That way, he indicated, his English still marked by the rhythms of his own tongue. A pass through the hills. Safer. It leads to lands, he explained, where people were fewer, and where perhaps judgment was less swift, less harsh. It was time for them to leave. A pang of something akin to sorrow, sharp and unexpected, pierced Martha. She had found an unlikely, unbelievable sanctuary here, a depth of kindness she had long ceased to believe could exist in this hard world. She looked at Tavik, this stern, imposing warrior who had shown her and her vulnerable children such profound, unmerited grace. Words felt utterly inadequate. How could she ever thank him for their lives, for restoring not just their physical bodies, but her fractured faith in the possibility of goodness? She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears, her heart full. "Thank you, Tavik," she managed to whisper, the simple words carrying the weight of her immense gratitude. For everything. He merely inclined his head, his dark, unreadable eyes holding hers for a long, silent moment. "Go in safety, Martha woman," he said, his voice low and steady. "Keep your children strong. Protect them." Martha turned away from the Comanche camp with Samuel and Lily walking steadily by her side, their small hands once again clasped firmly in hers. But this time, there was no terror in their steps, only a quiet, resilient determination. She carried more than just the vital provisions for their onward journey. She carried a transformed heart, a heart that had borne witness to the truth that courage, honor, and profound compassion could blossom in the most unexpected, most uncultivated soil, far from the self-proclaimed bastions of piety and civilization that had so cruelly and casually cast her out. The outcast woman, who had stood at the precipice of offering her very soul for a mouthful of food, had instead been given a home, not a structure of wood and sod, but an intangible shelter woven from unexpected kindness, from shared humanity, deep in the wild, untamed heart of the West. And as she walked towards the distant, beckoning hills, towards an unknown but no longer entirely hopeless future, she knew that the tale of the Comanche warrior and his extraordinary gift would be a story she would tell her children, and perhaps one day, their children too, a lasting testament to a simple, powerful truth found not in scriptures or law books, but etched forever into the rugged, enduring soul of the dusty trail.